Hello, everybody. We have the amazing privilege of having Emily Roper here with us today. Emily is a neurodevelopmental delay therapist and midwife assistant. And I'm going to actually have her share some of the amazingness that she gets to do. But we're going to have a really fun conversation today about how to protect our children's development, how to fix problems when they arise, what we can do to kind of catch everybody that falls in between the cracks, and anything else that comes up in our conversation today. I know it's going to be a really good one. So, thank you for being here, Emily. Would you share with us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Like you said, I'm a neurodevelopmental delay therapist and I'm a midwife's assistant, which may seem like two completely unrelated jobs, but they actually intersect a lot. So, for my therapy practice, I work with kids who have developmental delays. So, typically ones that fall into the ADHD, autism spectrum, anxiety, learning disability categories.
Yeah.
And what I'm looking at is a bunch of different areas of brain and body development, typically things that are mostly developing during pregnancy and during that first year after birth. And all of these early pieces provide the foundation on which the rest of the brain develops and on which our nervous system functions. So, a lot of times you'll see older kids who are struggling with emotion regulation or they're struggling in school. And those problems can be traced back to things that should have developed properly during that first year after birth. And so I'm looking at all of those pieces, things like our fight or flight response, things like early primitive reflexes, things like the vestibular system, which is a piece in your ear that helps you know where you are in space. And it helps coordinate a lot of different areas of perception and awareness. And then I look at things like visual skills. So, how well kids can move and use their eyes, which is very important for reading and writing
Very
and later
important.
academics.
Absolutely. I love this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm just
No.
like my brain is going in a million directions now. I wrote down like five questions to keep me on track, but I know that will probably encompass a lot of that. But I think what you do is so important because so many providers, and this is, I was trained in conventional pediatric medicine, left conventional pediatric medicine, so thankful for all the PTs, OTs, speech therapists that I got to work with in the hospital because they helped me to see just a different perspective on child's development. Like we get to see them for 1 or 2 days and they're back home, right? We don't get to see that whole developmental process, but it's so important. And it's actually one of the I personally believe in pediatric medicine, it's one of the most overlooked
Mhm.
issues. We're looking at those milestones, which I'm sure you've seen that they changed those again recently, where it's like,
Mhm.
oh, let's just push that delay out
Mhm.
further instead of looking at the past 200 years worth of developmental data, right? That's like,
Mhm.
why aren't our kids meeting milestones? Those
Mhm.
are the questions we should be asking. And so I think your perspective on getting to see that process prenatally, because this is where a lot of those issues, for lack of a better word, in our child's development actually start, right?
That's
Is
right.
is in utero. And for the listeners out there, we're going to talk about this a little bit. I want you to make sure to check that shame response that's going to want to kick in. Most of us can't control the things that happen to us when we're pregnant. We're not choosing most of the time the stressors that are coming at us that impact intrauterine development, right? Whether that be recurrent miscarriages, and then you get pregnant again and you're having all of this stress of, am I going to lose the baby again? Things like that. We can't necessarily control that. So I want to make sure that you check yourself on the inside for the listeners, check the shame at the door. And because we're also going to be talking about what we can do about it afterwards to kind of reset that nervous system response and strengthen our child's development. So, can you tell us a little bit, Emily, about what are some of the things that happen in pregnancy that impact our child's development?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is everything. The really cool thing about the brain is that it develops based on experience. So the things that we experience, the way that we move, and the way that we interact with our environment dictates how the brain is going to develop and function. And the really cool thing about pregnancy is that when we have a baby who's developing inside mom, their nervous system is getting like little micro doses of how to function based on what her nervous system is doing. Same thing with lots of different areas of physiology. It's not just the brain.
Yeah.
So, everything that mom experiences throughout pregnancy is teaching this baby how to function. And that's actually really very smart and adaptive because this baby is going to be born into the same world that she exists in. And if she is functional and well adjusted and healthy in this world, then that's exactly how her baby's nervous system should start to develop too. So things like stress, things like nutrient density, things like blood sugar, all of those things are basically giving baby little micro experiences that teach them how well to function. The problem comes in when we have things like significant chronic stress, which we talk about, like we hear stress a lot and think, okay, that's such a bad thing. But stress by itself is actually really, really important. What we
Right.
want is to experience stressors and then to calm down and have a body that knows how to react to stress in a healthy way, which means we experience it, we figure out what needs to be done with it, and we move through it. What we see, the problems that we see are when we have these elevated chronic levels of stress. And that can happen for a lot of different reasons. Mom's emotional well-being, mom's, just environmental state is a big deal. But for babies also, it can be things like our toxin load and things in the environment that we're experiencing. Like, for example, they recently did a study and tested umbilical cord blood and found over 200 known toxins in umbilical
Right.
cord blood that didn't exist there
Which
200 years
is
ago.
crazy.
Um,
Makes a
and
lot of
so,
sense though, doesn't it? It's like,
yes,
oh, well, that sure explains a lot. Okay.
that's not good. And
No.
so when you have this cumulative toxin load, it's just going to really hamper the brain and body's ability to function optimally. And it may not be that that is enough to cause one really significant problem like we see with major birth defects, but it's certainly likely to have an effect on other areas of the way that the brain and body develop. So, what we're getting is a lot of babies that go through pregnancy that have just experienced a significant amount of physiological and then physical stress. And that is going to impact how well their nervous system functions after. Um,
Absolutely. No,
so
go
that's
ahead.
kind of
Keep going.
the
Yeah.
bigger ones on pregnancy. There's a lot of different things, obviously, medical conditions, how well mom's health is, basically anything that's going on with her, baby's getting a bit of that. So,
Absolutely. And no, and it's so I think what's interesting about this conversation, I love that you highlighted that it's it's not that we want to live, it's not that we need to live in a world where there is no stress, right? It doesn't
right.
exist. There is no bubble in which that exists. Like even anthropologically, if you look back, pregnant women, they were out gathering, they were hunting, they were doing
Yes.
like they were very, very exposed to stress, but the shift is that they also had rest, right? They also had this adaptive stress response where we're meant to be able to shift gears. And what's not happening, I think, in our culture is that we live constantly in this high state of stress where even if we're sleeping, we're not
Mhm.
necessarily shifting nervous system states.
Mhm.
And that's what's impacting our babies, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And their development. And I know, I've talked about this before on my podcast that similar to many of our listeners here, there are things that happen to us during pregnancy that we can't control, right?
Mhm.
So, my dad was diagnosed with brain cancer, for example, when I was, well, actually, before I found out I was pregnant, would not have planned a pregnancy during that time, but surprise happens,
Mhm.
and that definitely primed my baby's nervous system for a certain type of cortisol response,
Mhm.
right? Now, thankfully, I was somewhat aware of that and began certain, therapies and supports for her pretty early on. Um, Meaning like regular chiropractic care, right?
Mhm.
Regular adjustments. I would say that's like one of the biggest ones before you ever see any kind of delay issue because she really didn't have any delays. It was more just, I know how this impacted my body. There's no way it didn't impact hers. There's no
Yeah.
way. Like you can't separate the two, right? And So I really love that you touched on that, that the goal is adaptive stress. The goal is an adaptive nervous system. Because I think so many of us actually get stressed about our stress. Like I'm stressed out and I'm not
Yeah.
supposed to be stressed out, and that's making things worse, right? And that's not healthy either. So, and especially, our hormones are more sensitive in pregnancy. Like
Hmm.
we are more sensitive to stress in pregnancy
Hmm.
and postpartum as well. So even when we're learning all of these things about how to protect our internal and our external environment, making, if we're doing all the things, right? Like making sure we're getting clean water and nourishing food and supporting our systems. Sometimes even then, things don't always go right. So can we talk about what you see in that like early postpartum period, maybe for mom and baby, that would cue you in to we need to start doing some work here, and correcting things before they become bigger problems. I'm not sure if I articulated that right, but are there certain red flags that you see during that kind of acute period that would tell you as the practitioner, that we need to be supporting them in a specific way?
Sure. Yeah, actually, what's interesting is the most common risk factors that I see actually have to do with birth and immediate
Okay.
postpartum, which is not something that I learned about when I was going through undergrad in all of my psych classes. The focus was mostly on prenatal care. Like we know how
Right.
much pregnancy impacts babies and
Right.
development. And then the first year, we know how much that period impacts babies because there's so much brain development. But a lot of us really just skip over birth and that early, immediate postpartum period. I think just because it's such a short period of time that
Right.
we don't realize how big of an impact it is. So that's the kind of critical window that I'm looking at a lot of times. I mean, I look at all three areas.
Of course. Yeah.
But there's a couple of big things that are happening during labor and birth that most people don't realize. And that is that babies are going from being a fetus to being a newborn. And physically and physiologically, that looks very different. They make this massive, massive transition where they have to start breathing on their own, they have to start digesting on their own. They take over a lot of different physiological functions that mom regulates before
Right.
then. And all of those, that whole transition is basically brain and nervous system function. All of those
Right.
things are brain function. And the process of labor helps to set them up to optimize that transition. And they use a lot of different early reflexes to make that happen. So babies are what we call active participants in their own birth. It's not
Right.
just a passive process for them, they are
Right.
participating. And that helps strengthen their reflexes. It helps to prime their nervous system to have a really appropriate and actually very sensitive stress response after they're
Mm.
born. So they're born and they have this reflex called a moro, which is the infant version of our fight or flight response. And it
Mm.
gets triggered by really any sudden change. So exposure to gravity, lights, cold, touch, all of these new things that they're now experiencing creates this stress response in them, which helps them to take a deep breath. It causes crying. It
Right.
really elevates all of their stress hormones. So, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, all of those things spike, which is really, really important to help them make that transition. Their cortisol levels in the womb tend to be very low, and then they need much higher levels after they're born to maintain all of that physiological changes that they're making. Labor helps to elevate those, and then having this really sensitive startle reflex after helps to keep those elevated in an
Mm.
appropriate way. It also triggers a lot of attachment behaviors in
Mm.
parents and caregivers. So babies have this big dramatic startle, and then we very naturally comfort them and soothe them. And that response is teaching them how to exist in a world that is sometimes scary and dangerous. And it is teaching them that they are safe and somebody will take care of them, which is our earliest form of attachment and the way that we relate to and connect to other people. So there's a lot of really important and impressive things that are happening during this early stage. And when you see a lot of complications with the birth process, things like induction, like forceps or vacuum delivery, things
Yeah,
like cesareans, things like babies being separated from mom after birth, even things like them cutting the cord right away and babies not
right.
getting their full blood supply. All of these things disrupt that process, and it's more likely to lead with problems with the way all of those reflexes develop and function after.
Right.
So, the most common thing I see in my practice is kids that still have that really
Retained
hyperactive Moro.
Moro.
That's right.
Absolutely. I love that you touched on this. It's funny because I was just recording a later episode about the Moro reflex, so I'm glad that we're priming the pump for that because that's one of the biggest ones that I see for actually chronic immune activation in
Yes.
children is a retained Moro reflex. So, but I love that you frame this in a way because all reflexes are meant to be protective and adaptive, but they're also meant to go away at specific stages with the right support, right?
Yes.
Whether that's attachment support or being fed appropriately or getting enough stimulation or all of the different sensory nervous system development responses, right? And so what's interesting to me about what you're sharing about, and again, that's just like one of the reflexes, right?
Hmm.
There's a lot that we look at, but that's a really important one because it's meant to be that to protect attachment with the parent, to drive attachment with the parent, and yet it gets disrupted and stuck. And
Hmm.
then it shows up. How does it show up, let's say 6 months, 12 months, and beyond? Like, what do you normally see in your practice that would cue a parent um, that maybe something needs to be attended to?
Yeah, it shows up in a lot of different ways. It kind of depends on the child and how they have learned to cope and their personality. But essentially, what you have to think about is that these kids are basically living in a really heightened stress response.
Yeah.
So they startle more easily, and then physiologically, they have a much bigger reaction than they
Mm,
should. And so when you live with that type of response to the world, it creates lots of secondary problems like immune
mm,
function. It contributes to things like allergies and asthma and a lot of physical health stuff. But it also really tanks our ability to learn to regulate our emotions, especially
mm.
independently. So a lot of these kids are just the kids that cannot regulate without co-regulation. They're very
Okay.
dependent on somebody else. They're kind of stuck in that perpetual toddlerhood stage where
Okay.
everything creates a lot of big emotions. They have a lot of well, some kids get really anxious and withdrawn, so you see more of that fear response. Some kids
Yeah.
get really angry and they tend to have more of that fight and defiance response. Some kids vacillate back and forth depending on the situation, but I see a lot of emotional immaturity. And then also, it affects things like our focus and attention because our
Mm-hmm.
entire arousal circuit is dependent on how our stress response functions.
Yep.
So, things like attention, things like sleep, like wakefulness, all of those things have their roots in how well our stress response
Mm-hmm.
functions. So, it's very difficult for a lot of kids to focus their attention. They tend to be kind of hyper fixated on any little
Mm.
things in the environment. They're very easily
Yes.
distracted, or they
Almost
can
like
get,
sensory overwhelm
yes,
too. I see a lot of overlap with that.
yes.
Yeah.
A huge connection between that and the way our senses develop and how we process sensory information. Very difficult to process sensory information effectively when your body is hyper reacting to
Right.
things. And some kids even will end up shutting down where you'll see they're very hyposensitive. They just don't
Mm.
respond to stuff anymore because it's too much.
Yeah.
So you see just a lot of these secondary side effects. It's probably the single biggest thing that I see in my practice. It's what I spend the most time working on. It's
Absolutely.
very prevalent in the population of kids that I work with. It seems like in the US in particular, we're just seeing tons and tons of kids that have retained Moros.
Yeah.
It's almost more common than not.
I am so glad that you said that because that's what I've been observing as well. And I'm like, is it just me? Is it just my
It's
practice?
not.
Like, am I just like, I'm trying to get a feel with other providers. Like, is everybody else seeing this explosion? And again, like I've chatted about on other episodes, it's not that we're getting better at assessing. It's not just that. I
No.
genuinely don't believe that. because the data doesn't show that. The data shows that the numbers themselves are higher. And
Yeah.
so when you're working with a child, let's say there's neurodevelopmental delay. Um, what are some of and I know that's a big, broad
Mhm.
category, right? So we're going to use that as a big umbrella that catches a lot of different things. What are some of the factors that get in the way of them recovering? Because this is a conversation I really like to have with parents about removing obstacles to healing. Because for example, I come from the functional medicine space, right? Where I'm looking at GI maps and I'm looking at inflammation
Mhm.
and immune activation and all of these different things that are really important for the nervous system development
Mhm.
because the nervous system isn't going to heal if the body's inflamed.
Mhm.
Similarly to the body's not going to heal if the nervous system is overactivated, right? So when you're working with a child, what are some things that you're kind of thinking in the back of your head or maybe even addressing up front in terms of things that cause obstacles to their recovery and healing? What are some of those things that you see in your practice? Because I think these are the things that parents maybe we don't always have time to educate them on, maybe
Mhm.
in a meeting, right? Or
Mhm.
in their child's development. So I thought this would be a good conversation to have around that.
Yeah, that's great. I think taking that kind of holistic look is super important. And in my experience, it really seems to vary from child to child. So there's a couple of big things that are always red flags to me, and that's if home life is not stable, then it's
Yes.
very hard to make any progress. Like if you
Yeah.
look at the original Maslow's hierarchy of need,
Right.
safety has to come first. If we are not in a safe environment, then it's actually not functional for our nervous system to be calm and regulated.
Yeah.
Being in
It's
this
not
kind of
protective.
heightened arousal is functional if your environment is not safe. And so
Yeah.
we really have to have like safety first. That is
Yeah.
protective first. And so a lot of times that doesn't necessarily mean that the environment is not safe. It could be that parents are both dealing with their own emotional and attachment
Yeah.
issues. And so a big thing that we focus on is parental mental health and well-being
Yes.
and getting them support if that's something that they need. That's huge.
Absolutely.
It's huge for your kiddos. Um, Nutritional and gut stuff is big too. And I see, it's like you mentioned, I see it both ways. I see a lot of kids who have a lot of gut and immune issues. And sometimes when we work on the moro and the stress response, those things start to clear up and they look
Yeah.
great. Other
Right.
times we are just stuck and not getting anywhere, and we get help on the gut and the immune stuff. And all of a sudden, the nervous system starts improving.
Right.
And so it really kind of depends on the child, and I take it individually and look at them and see. If I know that they have like a lot of digestive symptoms, a lot of those things going on, then I always recommend that they work with somebody at the same time to do gut stuff so that we can really be supportive. But you have to be careful with any of these things too, because making big changes to diet, big changes to gut health can be kind of intense and stressful. And so we want
Absolutely.
to like ease into some of these things a little bit too. Um, the other thing that I see a lot of is breathing and airway and sleep
Yes.
issues.
Oh my gosh.
It's
So many.
very prevalent. And again, sometimes when we work on the stress response, I see weird changes in breathing. And all of a sudden they're like nose breathing, and we've done nothing to work on breathing
Right.
stuff. Same thing with sleep. All of a sudden they're sleeping and they're doing great. Other times they really need to work with an airway specialist to get the
Yes.
breathing on board. I am also doing like a Buteyko breathing course, so I know a lot
Awesome.
about that. So I incorporate some of those things into it, but I'm not an airway specialist. So if kids have a lot of things going on, then I
Right.
refer
You can
out for that.
triage them out to the for the big stuff for sure. Yeah,
Yes.
I love that you touched a little bit on oh, I'm gonna reframe my thinking because again I have like two thoughts happening at once here. Um, so there's a couple things. It's the we have to be practitioners that are looking at the whole person, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's what drives me in my practice, and it sounds like what drives you as well is like I want to know as much as I can
Mhm.
for two reasons. One, so that I'm better equipped to help you because you're already in front of me. And so I might as well help you with as much information as I can. But two, so I can hand you over to somebody who can without just saying, oh, that's just normal, or oh, that
Yeah.
runs in your family. Everybody has a narrow palate in your family. Of course, you're going to have breathing troubles. Like, we can totally fix that. Like, now
Yes.
we have all of these tools, right? There's no excuse in these areas. So I love that you look at it through that holistic lens because every child is so unique. And I think that that also brings up a point in, we get a lot of kids in our practice that have worked with other practitioners that not necessarily in the like occupational physical therapy side of things, but in the functional medicine space that have pushed really, really hard on eradication. And
Mm,
it's above and beyond the child's capacity
mhm,
to heal, right? And so they're pushing through crazy detoxes that don't
mhm,
need to happen, that have outpaced their own nervous system. And so I love that you mentioned that, like, usually slow and steady,
mhm,
gentle, one or two things at a time. Let's address this at a pace that the body can actually handle. So and I going back to your point about how we didn't learn a lot about, same in my nursing program. I mean, I did a mental health, or sorry, maternal health rotation. We all do. And a psych rotation, right? So we're learning about maternal mental health as well, but the most critical period is that immediate after birth, right? It's the sharpest drop in hormones a woman will ever experience in her life, even
mhm,
above and beyond menopause, right? And so, and yet we're not taking into account how that impacts her nervous system. And what I have found, I'm curious what you think about this. What I have found is that that period of time exposes so many susceptibilities that a woman maybe was not aware of. Like, maybe you
mhm,
were coping, maybe you were dealing with your own trauma issues, your own attachment issues, you were coping fine, right? But then you have this massive drop in hormones, a brand new baby, you're not sleeping, you have massive physiologic stressors, and now all of a sudden all of this stuff comes up to the surface. So, I would love to hear if you wouldn't mind sharing some words of encouragement or maybe some direction for moms who are in that critical period, or maybe who did experience that and now they're 10 years out from that, but emotionally
mhm.
haven't fully recovered from that, like how traumatic that was, right? Or how stressful that was. What would you say to a mom who's kind of in that
Oh
position?
man, that's tough because you're right. It is one of the hardest periods that we ever experience. It is a massive hormonal drop, major life changes, no sleep, usually on being poorly nourished,
Right.
and a
Really
lot
stressed
of
out.
yeah, a lot of moms also just don't have the social and community support.
No.
We are very tribal people that should be very surrounded by a lot of supportive people,
Right.
that should have everything else taken care of so that we can focus on baby. And that just doesn't happen as much as it should
Yeah.
in our society. So it's something that I see that contributes to long-term mental health
Yeah.
struggles for mom for years down the road.
Yep.
There is help, though. There's a lot of therapists who focus on kind of recovery from that time period.
Yep.
And if you're in the middle of it, it can be very hard to make adjustments when you're in the middle of it. But the
Yeah.
the best thing that you can do is just try to really buckle down and support yourself as much as possible. Rest as much as you can, get as much nutrient dense food as you can, reach out to people who are genuinely supportive if you have them. It's very hard when you're in the middle of it. It's a
Yeah.
lot easier if you can kind of lay that foundation ahead of time and make that plan.
Absolutely.
So many moms like really over prepare for birth, which is a good thing.
Yes.
I mean, birth is important, but
It's
then you have
important.
this baby,
We
and all
under
of a sudden,
prepare for the mental health we under
yes.
prepare. Yes. I mean, I know for myself, like, I knew that my mom and my aunts had experienced postpartum depression. And so I kind of knew, like, I should be aware of this, right? Like, I should be aware of maybe some genetic susceptibility there. I didn't have postpartum depression with my first. I had really bad postpartum anxiety that I felt like nobody was, I didn't know that's what it was. I just thought I'm really protective, I'm a little bit
Hmm.
hypervigilant. Honestly, I didn't know that it was a thing because everybody talks about postpartum depression, not as much conversation about postpartum anxiety. So the second time around, I had a lot of conversations with my husband about
Hmm.
this postpartum needs to look really different
Hmm.
because now I'm aware of what can happen, right? And granted, I ended up having a baby that was breech and a C-section, and thankfully it was not emergent. And she was the happiest, easiest baby ever, which made postpartum a lot
That's
easier
great.
because because when you have a happy baby, it's, when you're sleep deprived, at least it's like they're not screaming at you the whole time they're awake, right? But that being said, it took so much more mental preparation the second time around because I knew like what
Hmm.
this could look like. And I just think there's like we're trying, you, myself, and all the other practitioners out there, we're trying desperately to fill in those gaps of how can we support the people that we're supporting, right? And get
Hmm.
them the education. And if they find themselves over preparing for birth and even preparing for the mental health challenges after birth, and then they're thrown the curveballs of my child isn't developing normally, let's now get in there and start reversing this stuff as quickly as we can. And
Hmm.
one of the things I love about working with kids is that they are so resilient. And I don't say that in a way to excuse our neglect of the early signs.
Yes.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying we get to be blind to that stuff anymore. We really don't have an excuse. We know too much now. um, but I say that to say that even if you're a parent listening that's like, oh, maybe the autism isn't just something I have to accept in terms of it's this state permanently forever. Or
Hmm.
maybe their ADHD or their anxiety isn't just genetic. Maybe I can help them, right? Maybe I can
Hmm.
support them to realize that there are so many things that we can do to start reversing some of the, I don't even want to use the word damage. What word would you use?
The
The
symptoms. We talk a lot about just
yeah,
symptoms.
the impact, the symptoms,
Yeah.
the impact. That's a better way to say it. And you have a lot of really good people too that are we do have a lot of really good practitioners now that I think are very eager to help, reverse
Mhm.
some of that damage. So as we wrap up today's episode, I'd love to hear just any words of encouragement that you have for our listeners that may be recognizing signs of delay or dysregulation or stuckness in their child and what you might say to encourage them today.
Yeah, well, it's like you said, we're very resilient, and that's completely adaptive. So if you think about, we have all this information, all this focus on trauma and how traumatic things just cause all of these negative downstream effects and how
Right.
susceptible we are to trauma. And the reality is we are only as susceptible to trauma as we are to also healing. That our
Yes.
brain and our
Totally.
nervous system
Yeah.
are supposed to adapt to the things that we experience. We experience a lot of negative, traumatic things. We are existing in a dangerous environment. Our nervous system responds to that.
Yeah.
The same is also true if you get the right type of therapeutic input, if you get the right type of safety, the right type of nutrition, then our brains and bodies are meant to respond to that in a healthy and healing way. And so many of these things are very reversible and very treatable if you can give kids the things that they need. And a lot of times that starts with also taking care of yourself and not
Absolutely.
expecting like this perfection and not living in this like
Mm,
panic of, oh, well, we've screwed them up forever now and all of
right.
these bad things happened and there's nothing we can
Yeah.
do about it. But our brains are very adaptive and they want to
Mhm.
heal and they want to grow and they want to function well. So,
Yeah, that's really good. I love that you landed on that, like not living in that place of regret and guilt and the shame spiral, right? That happens to all of us, right? At different points. And it's because we care about our kids. We want the best for them,
yeah.
but it's not that in itself can keep us stuck in a stress response that's not actually then it actually what I see, for myself but also for parents that I work with is it actually prevents you from seeing the stuff that is healing, right?
Hmm.
And accepting the pace, which I've
Hmm.
talked about at other times. Like if I'm living in shame, I'm going to be filtering everything that I see about my child's development through that filter. And instead of just radically accepting all of the things that got us here, right, that
Hmm.
landed us in this space, when we do that work, right, which usually does take a little bit of work and probably a therapist, um, that's not bad work. It's so good. It's healthy for our kids too. So I
Yes.
I really appreciate your time. I feel like we'll probably have to do a follow-up episode where we can dive even more into these topics.
Of
But
course.
for those of you that are listening, please make sure to give Emily a follow. I'm going to put her Instagram handle, her website, her podcast in the link in my show notes. She's got a lot of great content on her Instagram page and her website. I also loved, I was looking through your website this morning again, but I loved that you detailed out the reflexes, what they do, what they look like when they're not integrated. I think that can really help parents just understand that this is fixable, right? That this doesn't
Hmm.
have to be permanent. And whether you're looking for a functional approach or, starting on either end of this, we're going to start getting our kids better. So thank you so much for your time today, Emily. And thank you so much for those of you that are listening.
Thank you for having me. This was great.